Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today joins us from North Carolina. He's Bruce Jentleson, a professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University and a Wilson Center Global Fellow. Bruce is also a leading voice on international affairs and foreign policy for decades. Bruce, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, John.
So, last time we spoke, actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to indulge you personally for a second. And before we get into our subject matter, just tell us about how things are going at the university in the face of a global pandemic.
Well, it's really interesting. The immediate response of the university, right around spring break, early to mid-March, like all of the universities in America, was to convert to online classes. For the last 3 years prior to this, I actually had co-chaired with our provost the campus-wide advisory committee on online education. And it's interesting, we'd seen the debate from where it started, which was some people thought this was nirvana and others thought it was the end of the universe, to getting some really interesting things going in between, really creative kind of things, everything from our nursing school to the sciences to philosophy. But still, it was a sort of a small enterprise on campus. When COVID-19 hit, everybody had to jump into the deep end without even having a toe in the water. And the sense is that it worked to get through the semester, partly because relationships had already been established between professors and students for most of the semester. And some worked better than others. People are thinking come the fall, we haven't made any decisions yet at Duke, or I think really most American universities, but it's likely in some form we're going to have to be using online more than we have in the past. And so the goal is really to figure out what works, what doesn't, and to take some time in between semesters and learn how to do it better. And I think it can add to things. My own sense is it's a supplement to what we do in person, particularly with undergraduates. It really can't be a substitute. Mm-hmm. We just got to figure out how to make that supplement the best possible.
And you yourself, before all hell broke loose, were in Australia, is that correct?
So I had a visiting professorship at Australian National University in Canberra. Got there late January. So on the one hand, I got there right after their bushfires. And all of the effects of that, they were more or less over. But, you could see with your own eyes, you talk to people, and they really had experienced the consequences of climate change. Really, California has in our country, but very profoundly there. For a while, COVID was coming in relatively slowly. The big effect was they have a large enrollment of students from China, and they had not been able to come back. And by the way, higher ed is the third largest sector of their economy, so this was a really big hit. I can tell you, I think the day was March 11th. I gave a big public lecture in Canberra, the capital, on actually how foreign policy and our presidential election were going to interact. There were over 100 people there. People were not shaking hands, but still not social distancing. Within about 3 or 4 days, it changed. The United States started to shut down. Australia began to get more cases, the Tom Hanks, Rita Wilson case when they were filming in Melbourne. And so fortunately or unfortunately, when I think about it, we ended up having to leave early, realizing that we really needed to scramble back to the United States. And that was an adventure, which I won't go into, but we made it healthy. Since then, they went to all online, they socially distanced. And I will say that they've been doing extremely well. If you look at the data, they're basically squashing their curve, not just flattening it.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised if you got on one of the last flights out of the country.
Pretty much, close to it, yeah.
Yeah. So last time we spoke on this program, we were talking about the health of the global world order, the liberal world order. And now we ladle on top of that a global pandemic. And it wasn't doing particularly well at the time either. A lot of cracks were starting to show. So when you begin to analyze this and look ahead, how much do you think of this as something that is a transactional change, we'll get through it, and then business as usual will resume at the starting point that we left it? Or is this transformational where we're going to be looking at really big changes as we look into the crystal ball?
It's very transformational. If you think about it, I can't think of an issue in which, in the United States and much of the world, every morning families wake up and they think about how they're going to do. Is everybody healthy? What other adjustments? Do they still have a job? What other adjustments do they have to make in their daily life? After 9/11 in this country, we had a big impact, but nothing of that magnitude. And it's not an exception. We've had various kinds of global pandemics. We've had Ebola, we've had Zika, we've had SARS, we've had MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Norwegian Prime Minister and commissioner in the 90s and into the 2000s, head of the World Health Organization, who actually wrote a chapter about it in the book, The Peacemakers, which I did much of the research while I was at the Wilson Center. She had an expression, she said, in a globalized world, we live in a sea of microbes. So it's not just this one. This is a particularly virulent strain. And so we who do international relations, whether it's academics or in Washington or in the United Nations, we have great concern about things like weapons of mass destruction, which we should, and we continue to. Actually, I think what we're looking at now, along with that WMD, is what might call DMD, diseases of mass disruption, and potentially of mass destruction. And how we figure those in on a sustainable basis, more preventively, each one a little different than the other, but the same, elevates global health issues from a relatively small segment of the agenda to, it may not become for political reasons, but it really should be very close to the top of the international and the American agenda.
Mm-hmm. You bring that up, and I have some notes from a previous interview I did where in 2019, we spent $685 billion for the Pentagon, $7 billion for the CDC. So that's probably one of the places we're going to see that transformation begin in those expenditures. What, globalization, you've seen the literature, you've written some of the literature. This looks like it could cut both ways. COVID-19 is an argument for more integration and more cooperation. It's also for some an argument to secure your borders and to hunker down. Do you have any sense of how this may play out?
Yeah, one of the things that's driving me crazy, and from some people, we're not doing it in our conversation, are these headlines, the end of globalization. What COVID shows is the inherent interconnectedness of the 21st century world. This was not a biological weapon. We still don't know fully its origins, but these things happen, because the world is interconnected. So globalization cannot end, period. How we strike the balance between what we need to do in each of our countries and what we need to do together internationally does need to be thought through again. There was the notion 10, 20 years ago that globalization was the answer to every question in the world. We had been seeing that, as you said, in many respects, and this drives that home. For Americans, I think one of the things that we have trouble doing and need to do is to say to ourselves, what can we learn from other countries, right? I mean, what other countries in terms of their national policies to deal with this? There are always unique circumstances to any country, but go back to Australia and New Zealand. One's a conservative government in Australia, which did very poorly on the bushfires. The other's a liberal government in New Zealand. Both have squashed their curves. Germany has done pretty well, a number of other countries. So I think as Americans, as we have our policy debate, not just about what President Trump is and isn't doing right, that's very important, but it's not the only thing, is what might we learn? And then you can't surgically extract it from another country, but you can adapt it, and I really think that's important because frankly, we have not handled this well in so many ways. And there's all sorts of data to support that, and we're experiencing it. And so I think that's a really good perspective for Americans as we think about our own politics and our own policy. We are interconnected. And even if we got our policy perfectly right, whatever that means, that would not be enough because the world has to act together so that policies that are at the global level can be coordinated as well as the national.
Even before the pandemic, we were having discussions about democracy encountering a rough patch, nationalism on the rise, populism on the rise in the United States and abroad. Do you see how a country handles this, whether it's a top-down, practically a dictatorship or a command and control type of model versus how democracies have responded? Will there be a residual carryover? Ideologically, will people now begin to favor one system versus another based on which protected them better?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think each one has had its strengths and weaknesses. I mean, the general sense of China was it was a major failure in trying to hide the information, not just for the rest of the world, but for itself. And then to the extent that it has the authoritarian capacity to impose, stay-at-home measures that are a lot different than ours, it helped it control it. People point to Singapore and say, wow, isn't that great? But now it's breaking out all over the place in their migrant worker camps because they live in dorms. I think the question is, for each kind of system, how can you do the best you can do? I do think it can be exploited to feed demagoguery and nationalism that bashes others. You know, it's a good distraction to say it's somebody else's fault, not mine. But it really has to be something that challenges all of us. And I don't think it necessarily cuts in one direction, democracy or non-democracy, but it should be sort of each athlete, if you will, trying to be the best athlete we can be.
I know it's early, but in terms of winners and losers, and I hate to be so crass, but you'll see China now on the rebound is doing a lot of PR about how well they're handling things, even though they continue to deny the criticisms. Do you see that this will change that momentum? I mean, most of our discussions in recent years about the nature of the world and great powers competition has been about the rise of China. Does this take the wind out of China's sails, for example?
Yeah, I think, you know, they've tried to do that. They sent supplies quickly to Italy, and then there were complaints about the supplies being of poor quality. I actually think this is a great opportunity for win-wins, and I've been around the block too many times to be naive about it. But basically, you know, a conversation between an American president and a Chinese president along the lines of, look, we can play this game. You can bash us, we can bash you. But, you know, you got hurt and we got hurt. And, you know, the best for each of us is to find ways to coordinate and collaborate. By the way, that's what we did about SARS after they finally came forward on SARS. There had been a lot of that. If you look at I think there are about 70 projects now to develop vaccines around the world, according to the World Health Organization. And the United States is involved in about 25 of those, some just within the US, a lot in partnership. China, I think, is involved in about 15, some in partnership for us. So, you know, this is a game where, you know, it's a lose-lose if we both go about it that way. And there's a real win-win there that, you know, that could help both countries. It can help Xi Jinping stay in power. It can help an American, either current president or the next president, show that they can deal with the crisis. And that's not naive. It's just, it's pure pragmatism rather than sort of schoolyard, you know, I'm going to hit you because you hit me.
Yeah, it almost makes too much sense, doesn't it? Maybe that's the problem.
Yeah.
But what's your assessment, Bruce, of leadership as we look at the landscape? Angela Merkel, for example, has gotten high marks for her very straightforward commentary. Closer to home, Governor Cuomo. What is your sense of global leadership?
Yeah, I think when you look across the board, you're right. Angela Merkel was down around 30%. She's now about 70. You know, again, the Australian Prime Minister was in trouble. He's getting credit. So a couple things are coming through. One, I think, is as a leader, you have to communicate. You have to be honest with the people while being confident. You got to tell them we got a real problem on our hands. I'm not going to, and you need to know that I'm going to tell you that, but I'm confident we can deal with it. And here's how we're going to deal with it. Some of it is science, some of it is the experts. And within that, there really needs to be an element of empathy. You know, we used to joke about Bill Clinton did the I feel your pain a bit too much. Mm-hmm. But there has to be a sense that comes through is I get it as a human being, as a father, as a mother, as a grandmother, grandfather, whatever. That's also a part of that. So people really understand that. And then you have to communicate that you are, in effect, the chief executive, that you're on top of things, that you're deferring to the experts. We've seen that among governors, Republican and Democrat, Governor Cuomo and Governor Newsom, Governor Inslee and Governor Whitmer as Democrats, Governor DeWine and Governor Hogan and Governor Baker, you know, as Republicans. And that's really, those are the crucial qualities that are generic, that in any political system define the leaders who both are getting credit and who are helping their countries deal with this difficult situation.
The election adds another layer of complexity to the leadership question because American voters are going to get to decide that from the ground up come November. When you look ahead to America's role in the world and its capacity to lead, if Trump is reelected, does America first stay the mantra, or does he need to change course? And what would you envision a President Biden would bring to the table?
Yeah, I can't, you know, I don't think it's partisan for me to say that I think that a reelection of President Trump would be very bad for the country and the world. I've written on that a lot, and I think it's, there's a lot to back that up. I think a President Biden would have to demonstrate that when we think about leadership, this goes back to discussions you and I had before this crisis. It doesn't mean, follow us, we're always know best. It does mean that, our role is a great role as convener, and we bring a lot to the table. We bring a certain amount of expertise. We bring the innovation that comes through Americans, both civil society organizations and private sector. And we want to help everybody get to those win-wins. But it's very different than the old notion of sort of hub and spokes that, we always know best, we have the power, we have the capacity, and everybody else just takes their orders from us. It's a different conception of leadership that still acknowledges American power and what's left of our prestige and American resources, but is not so much that all the best ideas are made in Washington. And frankly, that is a problem, not just for this administration, for many people in previous administrations who kind of came out of the old Cold War mentality that it's not that we're in decline, it's just that the world has changed. And so when, I like to use as a Duke person, Coach K, right? So Coach K had a particular way of coaching before the one and done era. And then he had to adapt to a different era of one and done. And, it was a different context for leadership. And he tried to show that, a good leader knows you need different strategies for different situations. I'm not nominating him for president, just making it.
No, Bruce, always a pleasure. And your thoughtful analysis is welcome at any time, particularly welcome at these trying times. And you even worked in a sports analogy, so an extra bonus. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you and your family continue to stay well as you ride out this storm.
Thank you, John. The same to you and your family and your colleagues at the Wilson Center.
Thanks. Look forward to the next time. And to those of you listening and watching, thank you for joining us. Hope you'll join us again for another edition of Wilson Center Now. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.